History has a lot to tell us about the darkness in the human mind. Take the Doctor of Death, for example, who killed about 250 of his patients before he got caught. He went as far as changing their wills, leaving most of their fortune to himself. How about the serial killer who killed over 200 people in Ecuador and many more in Peru and Colombia? Don't get me started on the man who killed a little girl and sent a letter to her family with details of how he murdered and ate her. These stories send chills down your spine, and there are even more disturbing and scary people who have walked this earth. I'll begin with a real-life horror movie character who had a particular taste for furniture coverings, human skin. Ed Gein. In November 1957, Bernice Warden, a 58-year-old hardware store owner, disappeared in Plainfield. Bernice's son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Warden, recalled that Ed Gein had been in the store the previous evening and was due to return. Authorities arrested Gein at a local grocery store and proceeded to search his farm. They found Bernice Warden's beheaded body in a shed, hanging upside down with her torso hollowed out. But there was more. Chairs clothed in human skin, skulls made into bowls, a belt crafted from nipples, and a collection of masks made from the faces of women. Among the findings were the face mask and skull of Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had disappeared 3 years prior, confirming Gein's involvement in her death. Gein confessed to visiting local graveyards, where he dug up the bodies of recently buried women. He admitted to the murders of both Warden and Hogan, although he later recanted his confession regarding Hogan's death. While Gein inspired horror movie characters, the next person on my list was known by names such as the Boogeyman, the Grey Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and the Brooklyn Vampire. Albert Fish. On May 25, 1928, Albert Fish read an advertisement in the newspaper posted by a young man named Edward Budd who was seeking employment. Taking the opportunity, Fish visited the Budd family pretending to offer Edward a job. However, upon laying eyes on Edward's 10-year-old sister Grace, a new target was marked. Fish promised to return the following week to take Edward to his farm. On June 3, 1928, Fish returned, but not for Edward. He faked a story about attending his niece's birthday party and invited Grace to accompany him. The Budds, though hesitant, allowed their daughter to go with him. That was the last time they saw Grace alive. Years passed with no word of Grace's whereabouts. Then, in November of 1934, an unmarked envelope arrived at the Budd residence. In the letter, Fish described how he lured Grace away, murdered her, and ate her remains. During interrogation, Fish confessed to the murder of Grace Budd and provided a detailed account of his crimes. He had raped, murdered, and cannibalized at least 3 children. Albert Fish was sentenced to death, and on January 16, 1936, he was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. Dennis Rader. The year 1974 marked the beginning of Rader's fall into ill fame. On January 15th, the Otero family became his first known victims. Joseph and Julie Otero, along with their 2 children, Josephine and Joseph II, were found murdered in their home. Rader had cut the phone lines, entered the house, and proceeded to bind the family. One by one, he strangled them, taking pleasure in their helplessness and fear. But perhaps most disturbing was his need for recognition. Rader began sending mocking letters to the police and local media, describing his murders in detail and claiming responsibility, referring to himself as BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill. In 1974, he targeted Catherine Bright, breaking into her home and waiting for her return. When she arrived with her brother Kevin, Rader attempted to bind them both. A struggle ensued, and while Kevin managed to escape with his life, Catherine was not so lucky. Rader stabbed her multiple times before fleeing the scene. On April 27, 1985, he struck again. Maureen Hedge, a 53-year-old woman who lived just a few doors down from Rader, became his next victim. Rader transported her lifeless body to his church, where he posed and photographed her in various bondage positions, after which he disposed of her body in a remote ditch. He was eventually caught in 2005, his body count already at 10, and sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. Joachim Kroll. Nicknamed the Ruhr Cannibal and the Duisburg Man-Eater, Kroll's evil acts included murder, necrophilia, and cannibalism. From 1955 to his arrest on the 3rd of July, 1976, the true extent of his crimes was unimaginable. On the 8th of February, 1955, Irmgard Strahl, a 19-year-old woman, became his first known victim. She was brutally stabbed and raped by Kroll, after which he left her body in a barn without her internal organs. A year later, in 1956, he killed 12-year-old Erika Schuleta. On the 26th of July, 1959, Manuela Knott, a 16-year-old girl, was raped and strangled in the city park of Essen, her body violated with slices of flesh carved from her buttocks and thighs. What followed Kroll's killings was terrible to behold. He would strip the body, engaging in intercourse with it, and often returning to masturbate over it again. He often took parts of his victims' bodies back to his home, where he would cook and eat the flesh, claiming that it helped him save on grocery bills. Kroll's crimes continued through the 60s and 70s, killing at least 14 people before his capture. This was after a neighbor complained to the authorities about the foul smell caused by his sewage, which he credited to as guts when questioned. Jeffrey Dahmer. In 1978, Dahmer's life reached a turning point when his parents got divorced and his mother and brother moved away. He lived all alone in the family house and had the space to commit his first murder. A hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks became his first victim. Dahmer lured Hicks to his house, struck and strangled him to death. He disposed of Hicks's remains by smashing the bones and scattering them in the woods behind his house. It wasn't until 1987, 9 years after his first kill, that Dahmer killed again. Dahmer's pattern involved luring young men, often from gay bars, back to his apartment with promises of money or sex. Once there, he would drug his victims before strangling them to death. He would then cut up the bodies and attempt to dispose of the bodies by dissolving them in acid or boiling them to remove flesh from bone while keeping some parts as souvenirs. He engaged in necrophilia with the corpses of his victims and later confessed to keeping parts of his victims for consumption. He also attempted to create zombies by drilling holes into the heads of his victims and injecting hydrochloric acid or boiling water into their brains. Between 1988 and 1991, Dahmer's killing spree claimed the lives of 17 men and boys. Robert Hansen. Robert would watch his victims, learning their habits while waiting for the moment to strike. His targets were often women whom he believed would not be missed. With a practiced trick, Hansen drew women into his car, offering money for their company. But once inside, he would drive them to his home in Muldoon at gunpoint, where the true horror began. Trapped in his basement, Hansen's victims found themselves in a nightmare. Tied up and helpless, they were subjected to his savage urges. But for Hansen, the terror was only beginning. In a sick game of cat and mouse, he would take his captives to the remote wilderness, release them, and then hunt them down like a game. 18-year-old Celia Van Zanten's fate was sealed when she crossed paths with Hansen. Kidnapped and assaulted, she managed to escape, only to be beaten by the freezing wilderness. Her body, discovered on Christmas Day 1971, bore the marks of Hansen's brutality. Celia was the first of many. Hansen's reign of terror claimed the lives of at least 17 women, though authorities suspect the true count may be higher. He died in prison in 2014. H.H. Holmes. As the 19th century neared its final decade, Herman Mudgett, now bearing the nickname Dr. H.H. Holmes, moved to Chicago. In the Englewood neighborhood, Holmes began the construction of a unique structure that would later be known as the Murder Castle. To the outside world, it was to be a hotel, but the building was a maze of death, designed by Holmes with secret passages, soundproof rooms, and chutes that led to the basement, where Holmes's dark fantasies came to life. The Murder Castle had doors that could only be locked from the outside, gas lines to choke his victims, and a kiln large enough to burn human remains to ash. He preyed mostly on women, often employees or tenants, who were lured by his warm nature. Once in his grasp, Holmes would use various methods to end their lives, from suffocation to the use of his dissection table. He forged life insurance policies for his victims and sold their skeletons to medical institutions, making a business out of his crimes. He confessed to 27 murders and later inflated the number to more than 130, though some believe the true count could be even higher. He was hanged in 1896. Karl Denker. To the outside world, Denker was a man of the community who ran a shop where he sold goods made from leather and boneless meat. Denker was also a man of faith, volunteering as a cross-bearer and organist at the local Lutheran church. His devotion earned him the title of Papa from the townsfolk, a term that masked the monster within. Denker's first known victim, Ida Launer, vanished in 1903. Over the years, more would follow. Poor travelers and homeless beggars, individuals whose sudden disappearance raised little to no suspicion. The ledger he kept was a chilling proof of his crimes, a carefully kept record of the lives he took. It was this ledger that would later reveal the true extent of his crimes, confirming at least 30 victims, though the actual number may have been as high as 42 or more. Authorities found a box containing an assortment of human bones, pots filled with human fat, and items such as shoes, belts, braces, and shoelaces made from tanned human skin. There are also suspicions regarding Denker's acts of cannibalism and sale of human meat. Denker committed suicide by hanging himself in his prison cell a day after his arrest. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy's fall into darkness began in the early 1970s. Young women began to disappear at an alarming rate, and a pattern of kidnaps started to emerge. The first known attack occurred on January 4, 1974, when Bundy entered the basement apartment of Joni Lenz in Seattle, striking and sexually assaulting her. Lenz survived, but the attack left her with permanent physical and mental scars. Just a month later, on February 1st, Linda Ann Healy, a student at the University of Washington, vanished from her bedroom. Bundy had broken into her home, knocked her unconscious, and carried her away into the night. Throughout 1974, the disappearances continued, leaving behind a trail of questions. Bundy's method was effective. He would often fake an injury, using a cast or crutches to appear harmless and beg for help from his unsuspecting victims. On October 2nd, Nancy Wilcox disappeared in Holiday, a suburb of Salt Lake City. Melissa Smith, the Midvale police chief's daughter, vanished 10 days later. Her body was found 9 days after that, brutally raped and strangled. On Halloween, Laura Amy disappeared, and her body was later found on Thanksgiving Day. The pattern was without doubt, and the horror was spreading. By the time of his capture, he had raped and murdered at least 30 women across various states. He was executed by electric chair in 1989. John Wayne Gacy. As the 1970s marched on, the streets of Chicago became the hunting ground for John Wayne Gacy. His construction business, PDM Contractors, was not just a source of income, but a means to an end, a way to lure his victims with the promise of work. He would often approach young men, many of whom were down on their luck or looking for jobs, with offers too juicy to refuse. Once he had gained their trust, he would invite them back to his house on the pretense of discussing work, only for them to never return. Gacy's tricks extended beyond job offers. He was known to visit local bars and social events, always on the lookout for potential victims. His alter ego, Pogo the Clown, became a regular at children's parties and community gatherings, masking his dark side. He came up with a chilling routine to immobilize his victims, often starting with a demonstration of a magic trick involving handcuffs. Once they were rendered helpless, Gacy would subject them to unspeakable acts of torture and sexual assault before ultimately killing them. The crawl space beneath his house became a makeshift graveyard where he buried the bodies of his victims, one atop another, in shallow graves. Gacy eventually faced an array of charges for the murders of 33 young men and boys and was executed by lethal injection in 1994. Gilles de Rais. Gilles de Rais was once a respected marshal of France, hailed for his bravery alongside Joan of Arc, but his appetite for the good life knew no bounds. His castle in Tiffauges became the stage for grand feasts and plays that drained his wealth. It was during this time that Giles's fascination with the occult began to consume him. He sought the counsel of alchemists and magicians, diving into evil in hopes of discovering a way to convert base metals into gold. The countryside, once filled with the laughter of children, grew silent as one by one they began to vanish into the depths of his madness. The air was thick with rumors of young boys and girls who entered the gates of Giles's estates never to be seen again. The year 1440 marked the turning point in this dark tale. Gilles de Rais got into a quarrel with a clergyman. His arrest, initially unrelated to the missing children, revealed a horror that shocked the nation. Gilles faced an array of charges, the most ghastly of which were heresy, sodomy, and the murder of more than 100 children. Under the threat of torture, a method used to extract confessions during this brutal period, Gilles de Rais revealed the full extent of his acts. His confession detailed the ritualistic torture and murder of at least 40 innocent lives. He was burned and hanged in 1440. Alexander Pichushkin. On the 27th of July, 1992, Alexander Pichushkin, then just 18 years old, committed his first murder. He had arranged to meet with a classmate, Mikhail Odichuk, in Bitsa Park to discuss his plan to fill the 64 squares of a chessboard with victims. Odichuk, realizing the gravity of Pichushkin's intentions, decided to back out. Feeling mocked, Pichushkin strangled Odichuk, disposing of the body in a sewer entrance. It was the 17th of May, 2001, when Pichushkin, now in his late 20s, resumed his killings. He would befriend vulnerable elderly men, luring them to their deaths. One such victim was a 52-year-old man named Yevgeny Pronin. After a game of chess, Pichushkin invited Pronin for a walk in the park, under the pretense of visiting his dog's grave. After sharing a drink, Pichushkin ended Pronin's life with a deadly blow to the head before throwing his body into a well. This pattern of luring victims with alcohol and then delivering a deadly blow became Pichushkin's signature. From May 2001 to September 2005, he claimed the lives of 36 individuals. In some cases, he would sign his work by inserting sticks or vodka bottles into the shattered skulls of his victims. On the 24th of October 2007, Pichushkin was convicted of 49 murders and 3 attempted murders. He boldly asked the court to credit him with 11 more, bringing his total claimed victims to 60, mirroring the number of squares on a chessboard. He is currently serving a life term. Anatoly Onoprienko. Onoprienko's reign of terror began in 1989. His first known horror was the massacre of a family of 10 during an attempted robbery. 2 adults and 8 children lost their lives in an instant. Onoprienko and an accomplice named Sergei Rogozin carried weapons they claimed were for self-defense, but the outcome was anything but defensive. That same year, the horror continued. 5 individuals, including an 11-year-old boy, were found shot dead, their bodies burned beyond recognition. Onoprienko claimed the murders were an accident during a burglary, but the pattern of violence was emerging. On December 24, 1995, the festive season was ruined by the murder of the Zaychenko family of 4. Their home in Garmania was set ablaze after they were shot with a sawed-off double-barreled shotgun. The new year brought no comfort, as a family of 4 and a pedestrian fell victim to Onoprienko's wrath on January 2, 1996. Onoprienko's methods were cold and cruel. He would select an isolated household, create a disturbance to attract attention, and then kill each occupant, starting with the adult male. No one was spared, not even children. Onoprienko was found guilty of 52 counts of murder and sentenced to death. However, in a twist of fate, his sentence was dropped to life imprisonment as Ukraine moved to abolish the death penalty. He died of heart failure in prison in 2013. Andrei Chikatilo. In September 1978, Chikatilo's dark impulses resulted in his first recorded murder. 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova became his first victim when he lured her to an abandoned hut under the pretense of giving her gum. There, Chikatilo attempted to rape her, but when he failed, his frustration erupted into violence. He strangled and stabbed her, leaving her lifeless body in the Grushevka River. Despite evidence that pointed towards Chikatilo, including a bloodstain found at the scene, another man with a history of mental illness was wrongfully convicted for her death. Chikatilo, meanwhile, walked free. By 1983, the bodies of young women and children, lifeless and damaged, began to surface at an alarming rate in the Rostov Oblast. It was in this year that the authorities connected the dots between 4 victims, pointing to a serial killer at large. By September of 1983, the number of killings linked to the same person had risen to 6, showing the same pattern of stabbing, slashing, and unspeakable damage. A psychological profile painted the picture of a man who struggled with erectile dysfunction and could only achieve climax by stabbing his victims multiple times. By the time of his capture, he had killed 53 women and children. He was executed in 1994 by a gunshot to his head. David Parker Ray. David Ray Parker's methods showed one who had transformed his darkest fantasies into a chilling reality. The center of this nightmare was his toy box, a soundproofed trailer that sat on his property in Elephant Butte, New Mexico. This trailer was a torture chamber equipped with various devices designed for the sole purpose of inflicting pain and suffering. He had invested an estimated $100,000 into its creation, fitting it with sex toys, torture implements, syringes, and detailed diagrams that showed various methods of inflicting pain. Inside the trailer, Ray had elaborate constructions to confine and control his victims. A fur-lined coffin and makeshift stocks were among the devices used to immobilize the women he captured. The trailer was rigged to make escape nearly impossible. Above the surgical table where he strapped his victims, a mirror was mounted on the ceiling, forcing them to witness their own rape and torture. He would kidnap about 4 to 5 women each year, holding them captive for periods ranging from 2 to 3 months. During their captivity, the women were subjected to unspeakable acts of sexual abuse and torture, often involving surgical instruments and his partner. He is believed to have killed over 60 victims, although the exact number is unknown. He died of a heart attack in 2002. Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Born on the 29th of October 1954 in the south of Minas Gerais, Brazil, Pedro's life began with violence from his father, who, in a fit of rage, kicked Pedro's pregnant mother in the belly, bruising Pedro's skull. Reports indicate that by the age of 14, he had committed his first murder. The victim was the deputy mayor of Alfenas, Minas Gerais, whom Pedro killed in revenge for firing his father on accusations of theft. He moved to Mogi das Cruzes, São Paulo, where he met Maria Aparecida Olimpia, who would become his girlfriend. Her subsequent murder by gang members would spark a desire for vengeance that would define much of his life. Pedro's response to Maria's death was a series of killings, targeting those he held responsible. His actions earned him the nickname Pedrinho Matador, Killer Pete, a feared figure within the criminal underworld. After his arrest in 1973, he confessed to having killed more than 70 people, though the exact number of his victims remains uncertain. He continued to kill while in prison, claiming the lives of at least 47 fellow inmates according to his own accounts. He reportedly killed his own father while they were both in prison and removed his heart. He was shot dead by unknown assailants in 2023. Samuel Little. By the late 1970s, Little had been arrested 26 times in 11 states for crimes that included theft, assault, attempted rape, and fraud. Despite this, he managed to avoid any serious convictions. He began to act on his violent fantasies, targeting women who were often involved in prostitution or drugs. Little's method of operation was to offer these women a ride or a place to stay, only to later strangle them, leaving their bodies in remote locations. He would often transport the women to lonely areas, such as back alleys, dirt roads, or dense underbrush, where he could kill without witnesses houses and leave the bodies where they were unlikely to be found. In September of 2012, Little's DNA was entered into a national database, a tool that had not been available during the prime of his killing spree. The key moment came when Little's DNA was linked to 3 unsolved homicides from the 1980s in Los Angeles, California. The jury found him guilty of all 3 murders, and he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In a shocking twist, while in custody, Little began to confess to a number of other murders. He claimed to have killed 93 people between 1979 and 2005. He died in prison in 2020. The next on my list might be the scariest story yet. Pedro Lopez. Pedro Lopez targeted young girls from local communities and poor backgrounds, luring them away from safety only to rape and murder them in lonely areas. In 1978, Lopez's reign of terror in Peru reached a turning point. In Ayacuchos, an indigenous community, Lopez was caught attempting to kidnap a 9-year-old girl. They buried him alive, following their tribal law, but he was later handed over to the police and deported to Colombia. He moved to Ecuador, and by the late 1970s, young girls began to vanish at an alarming rate. In a busy market in Ecuador, a mother's vigilance stopped Lopez's attempt to abduct her 12-year-old daughter. The local community acted swiftly, delivering him into the hands of the authorities. Unaware that the police captain was undercover as a fellow inmate, he boasted of over 200 victims in Ecuador alone, with scores more in Peru and Colombia. He led investigators to the graves of 53 young girls, giving proof to his claims. He had 110 confirmed killings in Ecuador and the possibility of many more across the borders. Lopez walked free from prison in 1994. Following the country's maximum sentence of 16 years. His whereabouts are currently unknown. Harold Shipman. In 1975, Dr. Shipman developed an addiction to pethidine and spiraled out of control, forging prescriptions, the first of his many crimes. He was forced to leave his practice and enter a drug rehabilitation program. Afterwards, he relocated to Hyde, Greater Manchester in 1977, where he began to rebuild his career and reputation. As the years passed, a disturbing pattern began to form. Healthy patients were dying unexpectedly shortly after Shipman's visits. The turning point came in 1998 when an 81-year-old woman was found dead after a visit from Shipman. The suddenness of her death, combined with a recently changed will that surprisingly left her considerable fortune to Shipman, raised red flags. The woman's family prompted an investigation. Shipman had been giving lethal doses of diamorphine to his patients, signing their death certificates with fabricated causes to cover his tracks. Convicted on 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery, Shipman received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He committed suicide in prison in 2004. In 2005, an official inquiry was launched, and it was discovered that Shipman had killed an estimated 250 people, beginning in 1971. Luis Garavito. In the 1980s, Garavito began to target defenseless young boys from the streets of Colombia. He would appear as different characters: a priest, a farmer, a street vendor, a drug dealer, even a disabled person, to gain the trust of his young victims. He offered them gifts or the promise of money for work to draw them away from the public eye. Then, he would lead them on long walks to remote areas until they were too exhausted to resist or escape. Garavito would bind his victims, subjecting them to prolonged torture and sexual assault. His tools of terror included razor blades, candles, and lighters. Garavito kept a notebook where he wrote the names of his victims. Alone in his room, he would pace naked, praying for the boys he had murdered. As if seeking forgiveness for his sins, he would often mutilate his victims, keeping their severed toes as trophies. The year 1999 marked the end for the Beast. He confessed to the rape, torture, and murder of 147 minors, though the numbers are rumored up to 300. Initially, he was sentenced to 1853 years in prison, but the sentencing was later reduced to 22 years. He died in prison in 2023. The knowledge that most of these serial killers are dead or in prison makes me feel relieved, but then again, the world is still filled with crazy people, so are we really safe? Click on the videos showing on your screen to enjoy more.